If I had an hour to solve a problem, I'd spend 55 minutes thinking about the problem and 5 minutes thinking about solutions. When I was a child, my mother gave me a great gift. She taught me to ask questions. She told me not to accept things at face value, to question and to seek to understand things. She gave me curiosity. I learned to ask why. As I grew up, I was surprised that other people did not ask why. They simply accepted things as they were, and when I asked them on why they were doing something in a particular way, the answer more often than not boiled down to, because that's the way we've always done it. Often always may only go back as far as the person that taught them to do it that way in the first place. Before coming to the bank, I worked in a large finance department that was putting in a new system. With the existing system, when they made their daily payment run, they would print out a list of the payments, the payment supervisor would look over them, and if it was correct, sign the report and take it to the finance manager for final approval. This was then taken back to the payments clerk who finalised the payment run, and the file would be sent to the bank for processing. If the supervisor had any questions, they would go back to the clerk for the information. This is quite time consuming. This manual process was created because the existing system did not have a workflow. The new system they were putting in did have a built-in workflow and could manage this entire process electronically. When the clerk had finished creating the payment run, the supervisor would be notified that a payment run was ready for review. They could then review it in the system and investigate any payments they were unsure of. Once they had reviewed the run, they would click approve and it would automatically go to the finance manager for confirmation, who could sign off the run by return email. This had the potential to save a lot of time, so you'd think they'd jump at this new ability. But you'd be wrong. It didn't work out that way. You see, they'd written into their processes that the payment run had to be printed, signed, and countersigned. The print and sign process had evolved around the limitations of the technology of the time. This process had been created to satisfy an audit requirement that the appropriate checks and balances were performed. Everyone accepted that the audit trail had to be paper-based. They weren't willing to entertain the idea that an electronic audit trail could still meet the audit requirements. This is something we've been doing for a long time with many of our business processes. We frame our processes around the limitations of the technology that we have access to. When we introduce new technology, we then try to frame it around our existing processes. We don't ask why. When we do this, we end up with systems and processes that become increasingly introspective. We look more and more within the existing process for our solutions. We forget how to think outside the box, how to be innovative. We've stopped asking questions. We approach change within the framework of what we know. It's very hard to be innovative with this mindset. We need to start asking questions again. We need to start looking at what is possible, not just what is. Right now we tend to solve for the middle. We look for solutions that solve for the mainstream. We look at solutions that provide the most value for the greatest number of customers. There's not always a lot of information or innovation in that process. Sometimes it's good to take a wider view, to look at the outliers, look at things from a different perspective. The problem here is that we are not in the habit of being innovative. We spend too long thinking iteratively. We look at a process and think how we can improve it, but we keep the same essential process. We tweak rather than replace. We use the framework of the existing processes or products to design our new ones. A good example is the digital camera. It was actually invented by Kodak back in 1975. The engineer that developed it brought a fully working prototype to the board. They looked at it and said, no, we're a film company, and the idea was shelved. They only looked at the camera in the framework of their existing products, from an introspective position. They were worried it would cannibalize their film market. They didn't look at it from the customer's perspective. By the time they entered the market, it was already too late. That decision, or lack of decision, cost them dearly. In 2012, they filed for bankruptcy. Conversely, in the 90s, when the internet was starting to gain traction, a US bank wanted to develop their online presence, so they hired a consultant to help them design the new website. They wanted to know the best way to engage with their customers. The consultant told them that he wanted to interview the bank's strangest customers, the oddballs. The bank thought this was an odd request, but acceded nonetheless. It wasn't long before he was put in contact with a lady that came into a local branch every Friday afternoon and demanded to see her money. She was taken to the vault, saw the cash, and went home happy. Perfect, he said, and a meeting was set up. Within a minute of meeting her, he knew everything he needed to know. You see, she was a Jewish Holocaust survivor. In Germany, she was continually told that all of her money was in the bank and then one day it was all gone. From that encounter, he identified that trust was the most important aspect of the website. If he'd spoken to the normal customers, they would have talked about look and feel and functions that they wanted to see. By approaching the problem from another direction, he was able to identify the core of the solution needed to achieve their goal. From these two examples, we've seen one organisation that missed a golden opportunity because they failed to see the bigger picture, and one that took an innovative approach to develop a product that would resonate with their customers and help them build a better brand value. Some of this might seem a bit obvious, but it's important to be aware of what we're doing and how we are doing it. So here are 5 basic steps that you can use to help you develop better habits for achieving the desired outcome. It's important to remember that this is not a strictly linear process. Each step can introduce ideas that will impact what you did in the prior step. First up, let's identify the goal we wish to achieve. This is the most important part. If you don't know what you're trying to achieve, then nothing you do that follows will help. Are you addressing a symptom or the problem? Say it out loud to yourself. Tell it to someone else. Does it seem right? Ask yourself why. Does it need to be redefined? Is our definition too big or too small? Is it a composite definition? Do we need to break it down into smaller chunks? Don't worry if you don't hit the nail on the head here. After going through some of the next steps, you may gain some insights that will help you better define your goal. Once we have a goal identified, now let's try to identify what we know. This is the where we are now phase. Where do we get this information from? Well, that's going to vary depending on our goal. But as a general rule, start to make a list of what you know. Write it down, even inconsequential things. You'll be surprised at how much information you actually have. Writing it down helps you identify where the gaps in the information that might be. Writing it down helps you identify where the gaps are in the information that might be helpful in achieving the goal. It's important not just to look at the information that only relates to the goal. If your goal relates to something your customer will use, it's also worth looking at information about them that could be relevant. Don't be stingy here. Sometimes the smallest details can have dramatic impact on the outcome. Look at where else you can get information. Do your colleagues know something? Do you need to look at external sources? We collect a lot of data. Use it. Often, if you're trying to come up with something innovative, understanding the appropriate demographics will be helpful. Make assumptions. Ask questions. Question your assumptions. What do you know? Are these facts or perceptions? It's important to know which are which. Perceptions can be changed. Facts can't, but how we perceive them can. For example, we might be looking at how we can hire a more diversified workforce. Our statistics might show that only 10% of our hires are from a diversified background, so we might want to look at how we can change our hiring process to improve that. If we dig deeper, we might see that we actually hire 90% of our diversified applicants. So now our question changes to how can we attract a more diversified range of applicants? It's important to know the right question. Now, with all of the available information, do you need to adjust the goal? Does it need to be split, shrunk, expanded? Let's look at what is possible. Possibility is always creative. It takes us from what is to what could be. There are 3 basic approaches to this: possibility, fantasy, and provocation. With possibility, we stick within the realms of what is realistic and likely. This is how we normally try to achieve our goals. We define our solutions within the framework of the world as we know it. We put bigger brakes on cars to improve stocking power. Customize a data feed for a client to make it easier for them to process a bank statement. The next one is fantasy. When we use fantasy, we look at something that could not possibly be real, but would nevertheless help us to achieve our goal. In the late 1960s, the US police were looking at ways to combat rising crime levels. A comment was made that the police needed eyes in the back of their head. We all know that this is something that is not possible in any real sense, but this nonsense approach eventually gave rise to Neighbourhood Watch. Lastly, we have provocation. Pick an idea that is possible but unlikely. So a while back, Lotus wanted to improve the suspension of their racing cars. Instead of starting with the current design and looking at how they could improve it, they decided to start from scratch. They started with the premise that wheels were square. This was a completely absurd and left field approach. So they looked at how you could get a smooth ride with square wheels. Out of this approach, though, came the concept of intelligent or adaptive suspension. These are designs that we see in cars today. Don't limit yourself to a single possibility here. We all remember the days of brainstorming where we threw a lot of ideas up on the board and looked at their usefulness later. Well, do it now as well. The next step in our process will help us work out which ideas are worth pursuing. So now you have a pretty good idea of where you are and where you're going. You've collected what you know and you've listed some possibilities. So let's look at the possibilities we identified in our last step and see how we can develop them. With our possible ideas, this is a relatively straightforward process. It's basically what we do now. With our fantasy or provocative ideas, we look at how we can achieve the desired outcome. With a square wheel provocation, we look at how we can get a smooth ride despite the wheels not being smooth. Ask yourself, do we need to create something else to make this viable? Don't discard anything yet. Push yourself to see if you can use what you know to make it work. Now let's evaluate our developed solutions. Evaluate against any constraints, costs, benefits, regulations, what we know. Out of this, we'll see a few choices rise to the top that we can practically achieve. Remember, it's not our square wheels that we decide on, it's how we manage the square wheels that counts. It's more than evaluating purely on cost. Will the solution help gain more market share? Will it help us beat our competitor to market? Will it solve the customer's needs? Make sure you evaluate the options in terms of what you're trying to achieve. Now that we've evaluated the possibilities, we can identify the ones that will suit our purpose. Often we end up with a standout option. But if you have more than one viable option, well, can any of these be combined for a better solution? Or do you need to go back and reevaluate the options? Eventually, you'll settle on the preferred solution. So now you've identified your desired outcomes, looked at the options for achieving it, and evaluated against the relevant information and constraints you may have and determined your way forward. So now, what are you going to do about it? Well, this depends on the initial goal. If it was a simple thinking problem, such as creating a report for a customer, then we create the report. If it was evaluating which product or service to buy, then you acquire the product or service, or you create the proposal to acquire it. If it was for developing something, then we have to create a plan to achieve that goal. This is something we do now. The only difference here is that we can now trace how we arrived at our decision, and it gives us a high degree of confidence that what we are creating will achieve the desired outcome. So don't rush to solutions mode. Make sure you properly define your goal and identify the facts and challenge your assumptions. Remember, thinking in a structured way is a skill, one that only improves the more you practice. Thank you.